So I'm sure you have a great deal to say about it. So I actually don't read much historical fiction about the Holocaust. Almost as a matter of principle, I don't do it. And I'm sure you're all aware, the proliferation of scholarship on the Holocaust is just unbelievable, and I can't even keep up with what is actually being published in terms of nonfiction. So this was actually a treat for me to read this novel, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a great deal. I think it's a very responsible, if I could use that word. I mean, it's a subjective point, but I think it's a very responsible Holocaust novel. I think it's true to the experience, or tries to be as true as possible to the experience. I think the writing is powerful, engaging, emotional, and maybe one of the criticisms one could have about Holocaust nonfiction is that it tends to be maybe not as emotional. And this is not just a historical phenomenon, it's a human phenomenon. And good fiction, great fiction, enters into human emotion and captures things that maybe historians, I'm trained as a historian, are not necessarily able to do. The other aspect of this novel that I found so important, actually, is that it deals with the experiences of hidden children in Amsterdam, in particular. It gives us some insight into the Jewish community of Amsterdam prior to the war, and the Jewish community of Holland prior to the war, and the non-Jewish community. I think it insightfully and sensitively approaches a controversial subject, which is the subject of possible collaboration on the part of both non-Jews but also Jews in Holland. Indirectly, it focuses on the decisions made by the Jewish Council in Amsterdam, and we have versions of Jewish councils or Jewish leadership all across occupied Europe. And this has been a subject that's been written about. It's a controversial subject. Some people shy away from the subject in the sense that, for example, people would shy away from being critical of any victims of terror or victims of violence who might make some decisions that we find a little bit questionable. But she approaches it in this novel, and I think does so in a humanistic way. I think she allows the reader to make decisions about whether, in this case I'm talking about the Lang family, whether the decisions they made were appropriate or not. So what's the background? What's the historical background? And then we can get into the novel a little bit. What do we know? So we know that there were about 140,000, give or take, maybe it's 143,000 Jews who lived in Holland. We know that about 101,000 of them were deported to Westerbork, the collection camp, and that most of those deported from Westerbork were deported further east to the killing camps in Poland. We know that somewhere between 30 and 35,000 Jews survived the war in Holland. I mean, survived. Jews survived. We know that, we don't have the exact numbers, but we know that probably, and she actually has one of the main protagonists, Yoel Bloom, the Israeli novelist, in his research in the Jewish Historical Institute in Amsterdam, she actually says in the text that there were about 2,500 children who were hidden children. By the way, in the group of about 100,000 Jews who were deported east, there were 19,000 children. And of the 19,000 children, 18,000 were killed. We know that about 27,000 people survived in Holland in hiding, adults and children, or at least 27,000 people went into hiding, and we think somewhere around 17,000 or 18,000 of those people survived the war. And totally we have about 33,000 people who survived. So that's the historical background. We know that, and when I say we, I mean this is what the scholarship strongly suggests. We know that the Nazis initially, after the invasion and defeat in May of 1940, were at least initially interested or wanted the Dutch government to implement Nazi policies as much as possible, and that was the case. And people have speculated about Dutch character, just like people have speculated about German character. And I say it's speculation. You can think about it. You can believe it or not, but that the Dutch national character is a character of obedience, order, follow the instructions. Not saying blindly, but follow. And I think the Nazis certainly played on that. We know that the Jewish community was very well organized in Amsterdam. The Jewish Council was well organized. We know that the Jewish Council worked hard to see if it could facilitate Jewish immigration as much as possible. And it was to some degree successful, but not obviously totally successful. There's a marvelous book by historian Bernard Wasserstein, if you're interested in exploring this a little bit more, called The Ambiguity of Virtue. And he focuses on Jewish decisions in Holland, Jewish decisions in Amsterdam, Jewish decisions about immigration, choices made, who should emigrate, who should not emigrate, the moral complications of those kinds of decisions. And I think the title is very apt, The Ambiguity of Virtue. People try to do the right thing. Sometimes, I think it's almost always the case, try to do the right thing under circumstances that are extraordinarily difficult and fraught with danger. We often, human beings, we don't do our best thinking when we're under pressure. We don't make the right decisions or best decisions often when we're under pressure. And I think we have to constantly remind ourselves, not just when we're talking about the community here, but the situation of Jews across occupied Europe, the kind of pressure that people were under. And the lack of information. So I would say categorically that everybody in this room knows 100 times more about this history than the people who were experiencing this history 80 years ago. I often say that to my students. I say it over and over and over again because they don't necessarily believe it. They think it's not a true statement, it's an exaggeration, but I think it is a true statement. So this is generally the history as it pertains to this novel. The structure of the novel is, as you know, having read it, is really interesting. Really interesting to me. It's sort of a novel within a novel, as somebody once said about this book. It's a novel within a novel. It's probably a novel within a novel within a novel. I'm not a novelist. I'm not a writer of fiction, but that's, I think, a very difficult strategy, right? And she does an excellent job. I never found myself lost, and sometimes within the same short chapter or even within the same page, she'll go paragraph to paragraph, the novel within the novel, meaning Yoel reflecting on something in the present, Yoel in Amsterdam imagining his mother crossing the street, or whatever the situation might be. Yoel visiting the synagogue on Shabbat, Yoel imagining his parents leaving the synagogue on Shabbat. Seamless to me, it seemed. Really interesting, but seamless is not even the right word because I found it engaging. It like drew me in as a reader rather than confused me as a reader. Why this approach? Why did she choose to write a novel within a novel within a novel? And I think one reason might be what I just said, that I think she felt if she could do it, it would engage the reader. It would keep the reader, draw the reader into these multiple layered stories. But the other reason, I think, if I could be slightly autobiographical for the moment, I think it mirrors the experience of children of Holocaust survivors. So that's my experience. My parents were Holocaust survivors. And it's very common for the children of Holocaust survivors, not to know the stories of their parents, because our parents didn't tell us. In my case, one parent, my mother, did talk to my sister and me, and my father never talked to my sister and me. So what I learned about the Holocaust as a child was from my mother's perspective, and I'm not saying it wasn't true and powerful, it was unbelievably powerful. But I never, I'll say we, children of Holocaust survivors, typically, we don't have the full stories. Now you could say, well, that's the case of all children. All of us as children don't have the full stories of our parents. And that's true. That's true. But I would take it to another level. So in a way, the experience of children of survivors, in a sense, is a narrative within a narrative. And what we learned about our parents, we learned in a very fragmented, piecemeal way. I think we didn't get a full narrative, most of us, and some of us never got any narrative from our parents. But what we learned was a little bit here, and a little bit there, and a little bit there. But again, if I could just be autobiographical for a moment, there was some big things that we never learned, that our parents never told us, that some of us only found out later. I'm not going to talk, this is not a conversation about me, but I just want to emphasize that point, that there were several big, important parts of my parents' experience that they chose not to tell my sister and me. And we only found out later. So, in a way, I think that's what Emuna Elon is trying to accomplish in this, using this technique. It, in fact, mirrors what I think is often the case with children of survivors. What is she able to accomplish in this story? So she's able to, first of all, in the scheme of things, let me step back. In the scheme of things, you might say, okay, 2,500 hidden children in Holland, compared to whatever the number is, 1.5 million children who were killed. So, I'm not saying it's not an important story, I'm just playing angel's advocate for a second. Some people might say the terror, the fear, the decisions that parents made, they don't stand up to the genocidal elimination of 1.5 million children, probably more. That's not my position, just throwing it out there. It's not my position, absolutely not. In fact, I think we have to fight hard against that kind of generalization and say every single life, every single experience, as we all know, and that's what we feel, is important and valuable, and every single story is important and valuable to the extent that we can retrieve it, every single one. And we should never allow the forces of trying to, seduce us into hierarchies of suffering be successful. We have to resist that. And she's able to capture, and maybe in the discussion I can pull up some pages that were particularly powerful. Maybe you want to do that as well. Where she captures the terror, the fear, the unknown. Should I give my child to the resistance? Should I not give my child to the resistance? Am I ever going to see my child again? Well, I've given my oldest daughter. What about my baby? My boy, what should I do? Is it the right thing? Is it the wrong thing? Well, my husband is no longer here. I can't consult with him. The people who I thought were my friends are not really my friends. Nobody can give me an answer. Even the courageous resistance people can't give me an answer. Yes, we think you'll be reunited. We hope you'll be reunited. We have a plan for you to be reunited, but who knows? So how do you quantify that? How do you I can't actually when I think about it. I mean, probably the most difficult decision a parent could ever possibly make is those kinds of life and death decisions that you have to make in a moment, right? So her writing is engaging there, very powerful, and I think very effective. And I think that's one of maybe the most effective or most important parts of the story for me as somebody who doesn't typically read nonfiction, or fiction in this case, sorry, that she's able to capture that. The drip by drip loss of freedom and liberty that the Jews of Amsterdam were experiencing didn't happen overnight. It's not just Amsterdam. It happened in Germany, And then, okay, we can deal with that. So we have to give up our bicycles, but they're not going to take us, especially not us, because we're living in an apartment building with people who have influence, and they're our friends, and every week, every month, another regulation about what you can and cannot do, sort of sapping their sense of themselves, sapping their sense of their human agency, their control. I think she does that incredibly effectively, giving us a sense of that. It's important. Again, when we think of the Holocaust, I think our minds naturally go to killing camps and mass shooting experiences for millions of people, but I don't think we typically give enough attention to sort of this, as I said, this sort of drip by drip loss of one's freedom. That's a much better word. Loss of one's freedom. And I think she wants us, as I said earlier, wants us to think about what are the, what could have been done, what should have been done, and can we judge today? Is it even appropriate to think about the decisions, in her case, obviously fictional characters, but fictional characters that certainly represent what people were actually experiencing during that time. Is it appropriate to judge or not? If we don't judge, think about the implications of that for a second. If we don't judge, what are we actually saying? That those people that maybe made some decisions, they're not equally part of the human community that we're all part of, equally, susceptible to making bad decisions, and we have a responsibility, maybe, I hope responsibly, to engage in that, in some speculation about behavior. But I think we should do it with humility, and I think we should do it with restraint. Let's see. I think the other one or two more points maybe, and then we can. I'm just checking where we are in terms. Oh, it's 30 minutes already. We're not having fun, right? We're not having fun, but time is going by. There are lots of different themes going on here. I mean, there is the theme of identity. The novelist Yoel Bloom doesn't know really who he is. He's searching for himself. He remembers, because his mother, when she was alive, told him many, many times, you came here as a baby, we're from Amsterdam, I'm obviously paraphrasing. You're not going back to Amsterdam, and you're not asking me any questions. You're Israeli, you have a sister, we're not looking back. House on endless waters. The waters they're flowing down the stream, they're not coming back. So he doesn't know, right? He doesn't know what his history is. He doesn't know who he is. He's going to find out who he is. He knows very early on in the novel that he is not who he has been told he is. But you also know as a reader that even though he doesn't have the information, he has an instinct about that something is not right. Something is not computing. And I think this is a very subtle but profound insight into the transmission of trauma, even if you don't know that you've been traumatized. From generation to generation, which the scholarship is suggesting, psychological scholarship is suggesting is the case. That we transmit our experiences to our children and grandchildren, and in this case, he's transmitting whatever he's transmitting, and he has a fractured relationship with everybody, right? He's not a social person he's a, you know, take the description of him seriously. He's a famous novelist, right? He's going on book tours. His books are being translated. That's how he gets to Amsterdam initially. He's an important person, right? And people recognize him. Israelis in the street in Amsterdam recognize him. Are you Yoel? You know, he's somebody. But he doesn't know who that somebody is. And as he retrieves more and more of his history through the process of writing a novel about his history, right? That's, again, he's going back, doing research, writing this novel. He becomes more and more of a person, I think, more and more of a human being. And certainly by the end of the novel. So it's, again, kind of, it's not counterintuitive, because I think this is actually how life actually often happens to us, but he becomes a fuller person, a more social person, as the novel progresses. So, I don't know, maybe I'll stop here with my general remarks and turn it over to this fabulous group
Does anyone
for your comments or questions.
Yep, that's what I was just going to say. Anyone want to go first?
One of the things that impressed me so much about this book was that she writes as a first-person male character.
Can't hear you. Here. Hold the mic. You talk.
One of the things that impressed me most about this book is that it's a female author writing as a male protagonist. I found that gripped me as well as part of the story, how she achieved that. I'm just curious about how you felt about that.
I agree with you. I agree with you. I think when she is when she's writing, so to speak, as a male protagonist, writing the words and insights of Yoel, again, I think I found it very natural to me. And when she's talking about Sonia, it's natural to me. You know, she's just a very good writer. That's a skill. So I agree with that, sure.
I'm going to butt in with a question. So when our Book Sandwiched In committee was reading books last year for this season, one that we had read was nonfiction, and it was the new book that came out about who betrayed Anne Frank's family.
Yeah.
And we all, thought it was like, a fascinating story, but most of what we enjoyed about it was more background on Otto's life and the family things, more so maybe than sort of this, maybe a witch hunt or whatever you might call it. And then this controversy popped up. One of our committee members, Hinda, who's not here, was like, well, if we want to do a great book that has, a Holocaust story in Amsterdam, she recommended the one you just reviewed.
Yeah.
But I was wondering just if you had any thoughts on that book.
So I haven't read the book. I saw a documentary, probably based on the book. I can't recall if it was a PBS documentary. Was it? So of course there's controversy about that documentary, about the scholarship, so to speak, about the methodology. And some people would say, why are you going there? Why are you possibly revealing that the person who turned the Frank family in was part of the Jewish community, part of even Jewish leadership? So it then goes back to that point, what should we be doing as pursuers of truth? So to be perfectly honest about, so I can't speak to the book, but to be perfectly honest about the problem is there. I mean, I'm a historian, I write things, and I make choices about what I'm going to write. And I definitely make choices about what I'm not going to write. Right? I mean, I make choices. I would not have written that book. I would not have been involved in that research project. Not to say that it shouldn't be done, just because how does that advance knowledge? Other than the fact that Anne Frank is iconic, and you might say anything that gives us more information about what happened, who turned them in, we need to know that. Okay. But I think I wouldn't have done it, but I can't speak specifically to the book, so I'm sorry about that.
Oh, no, that's all right. It's still
Yeah.
just interesting background.
Yeah.
All right, let me come around. I'm going to go here first and then to the end.
I'd like to know what you think of the book as reflected in our own history. When we deny slavery, we deny the fascist, the 30s, and deny our refusal of the boats that came over. And
Yeah.
Franklin Roosevelt sent them away. How do you feel that reflects? Those were all choices that our country made and continues to make.
Yeah. It's a great question. So in that sense, so those are big historical questions that I think we have to pursue. Whether Anne Frank's family was turned in by a Jewish person or not, I could live without knowing the answer to that question. But we can't live without knowing what happened in our country. Probably help me out, because of course the name escapes me right now. The PBS documentary that was just done by the great
Ken Burns.
Ken Burns, thank you. So America and the Holocaust, I think, is the name of it, and I think it's about might be a 3-hour, might be a 6-hour, I don't remember now. 3-hour? Okay. If you haven't seen it, you should see it. I don't agree with everything in it, but I think he does a very good job of raising some of the questions you're raising. What really was our role? What was our history in the United States? And can we be honest about our own history? We're just now talking about Holocaust history, to say nothing about history that preceded the Holocaust that has to do with slavery, like you mentioned. So it's very, very important that we know what we did and explore that. History is not, the writing of history is not fact. There's a lot of subjectivity, but we have to be honest about exploring these kinds of questions. So just to maybe finish one point that you made in your question, I don't think there's any way to, for example, if we're thinking about the Nazi racial Nuremberg laws of 1935, I don't think we can think about or understand the Nuremberg laws of 1935 that begins to define who is Jewish and who is not, and all kinds of related issues, without understanding how carefully the Nazis looked at American Jim Crow laws in the 1920s, and so on. Literally looked, meaning Nazi jurists and scholars were doing research on American racial laws, to say nothing about lynching. And I think in one of the most powerful lines in the documentary, as I recall it, is by the historian Peter Hayes. When he's speaking about this issue, he says, when Americans started to complain about these laws in 1935, the answer that the Nazis gave, I think this is what Peter Hayes says, is a one-word answer: Mississippi. So don't preach to us, the Nazis said, don't preach to us about racial laws. And it's true, it's historically true. So it's important, it's very important. I agree with that, of course. Yeah.
All right, next question or comment? Yeah, let me come on over.
Even though you talk about the male point of view that the author writes about, what she leaves for us to feel the absolute pain of is the mother and how she could possibly have embraced and mothered this child where she's always thinking of her own child.
Yeah.
And I found that very affecting. And then to think about the girl who knows as well, the sister, who has to take part in this, the whole power of that.
Yeah, it's very powerful. I agree.
To think about that, I thought that was amazing. The other thing that impressed me was that in trying to find out what happened to himself and his family, he didn't rely on going. There was lots of places he could have gone, historical institutes, that he could have gone, and he kept on wanting to find out the identity of the picture that he saw, the people in the picture, and that they couldn't tell. But, and I know that the resistors, the records maybe might not have all come out, but he might have been able to find out what happened to the mother's child.
Yeah.
He seemed to resist that and had him try to relive the life that his parents, so-called, whoever his parents were, lived. He tried to imagine all of that, rather than to rely on the actual records. And I wondered, that seemed to bother me.
It bothered you? So, it didn't bother me because I think, I don't know, this might be a question, if we could ask the author, we should ask the author. One of the other beautiful parts of the book is the descriptions, very beautiful, meticulous descriptions of Amsterdam, the streets, the buildings, the museums. That clearly was important to the author to get, and in fact there is a passage someplace, which I could maybe find, where she actually has, I think she has Yoel Blum thinking, I would have much rather written about Amsterdam or much rather written about the art or the canals or whatever than what I'm writing about. So, first of all, I'm not an expert on Amsterdam, I've been several times, but my strong impression is that her descriptions are accurate and that she's very, she knows the city and loves the city, whether she's even visited many times, I don't know, but certainly researched the city. So the other reason why I think it didn't bother me is because I think, in fact, what you said in your question, he's somehow trying to relive the life of, that's not necessarily his mother, right, but relive the life. He's trying to retrace the life. And as we go through, and why? Why would you do that? What's the benefit? Well, to develop empathy for a person or a community or culture that's being destroyed, to truly develop that empathy. Empathy is maybe the hardest emotion to achieve, right? But to get as close as you can, don't you need to kind of try to relive that life, to put yourself in the story? By the end of the story, he's in the story. He's in the story. It almost goes line by line. He's suffering the fear and agony and paranoia that his mother or the mothers and fathers were suffering. By the end of the novel, he's in the story. I think she wants to try to achieve that in the novel, for herself as a writer and for us as readers, I think, yes.
I haven't read the book, but I have read several books that were recommended by Brighton Library by Ruta Septia. They are also people, and they're historical novels. They're considered youth novels as well. And my question is, and it was very disturbing for me to read those about Lithuania, about Franco Spain, and people trying to get out of Romania ahead of the Russians moving in, and the Germans right behind them destroying everything in their way, including all the people that were living there and fleeing. And she creates some fictitious older teenagers and sees it from their perspective. Would you recommend these historical fiction type novels to your age students? Because I'm glad I read them, but I'm not sure I'd recommend them to.
So what age are they geared? What age are they geared to these?
Well, they're youth, adult / novels in the library. They're listed under YA.
Young adult?
Young adult.
Young adult?
And she gives a lot of, as you said, picture of the country and the politics going on at the time. It gives them a real background. And I just went to Jiva and saw The Long Walk. And that is very similar from the Cherokee Indian, one person's perspective looking back into her family history and all the stories about how she needed to know so she would feel like a complete person and part of the Cherokee Nation, but she was half and half and hadn't really been raised entirely in that culture, and it's sort of disappearing.
Right.
Would you recommend this kind of thing to your students in college age?
Well, I don't censor for my students at college age. I don't censor. I don't censor books that they should or should not read. I assign a lot of books. It's probably I do it on purpose, knowing that contemporary college students are probably not going to read 9 books in a semester, but I think they should know at least what their professor thinks are 9 important books. And I say to them, if you don't read these during the semester, I'd like you to consider reading them at some point. Don't sell them back to the bookstore and read them. So I don't do trigger warnings, and I don't, but these are 19, 20, 21-year-old, 22-year-old people. To be, again, very honest with you, I would defer to the professionals on that question, because it's a very good question, and I don't have a good answer. I mean, I have grandkids who are, 12, 13, 14, and my wife and I have recommended and purchased books for them on this subject and others. But I don't feel like I have the expertise to know, what should a 12-year-old or, at what point. It's a very good question. It's an important question. Very important question.
So I'm going to answer because I buy all those books. I'm the teen services librarian, and they're written for the most part, ages 14 to 18. Ruta Sepeti's books. I've read all of them. Her first book, Between Shades of Grey, I believe they made it into a movie, and the main character, I think, is 14 in it. So typically grades 8 through 12 are who we would recommend them to. I went to a book discussion group on it with 8th graders at the middle school last year when we had Ruta Sepeti's. She actually zoomed in, and we did a program with her. And there were students who chose not to read it, and what we basically find is that kids and teens are very good at self-censoring. So they pick up a book, they start reading it, they don't like it, they put it down. If they can handle it and they like it, then they keep reading. Yeah, that's my short answer.
She had a lot in the back of the book about how she researched and came up with all
that author, she has a book that
historical more
Yeah, she's got one, something to the sea, and that one is a Holocaust related story too that has different points of view. I highly recommend them to anyone looking for some really good, realistic. And then I think we have time for one last question.
I'm not leaving, I'm just sitting.
Oh, you're fine. You can sit. Here, I'm going to get here. All right, we'll do two last questions. One here and then one here.
For the end.
Thank you. I wonder if you had any thoughts on the fact that the setting is the Dutch version of the Shoah. And I feel like, in general, the Dutch get a really good rap internationally. You know, the Dutch are great. And really, the Dutch colonial exploits were horrible. I mean, right up there. The Belgians. And in terms of the Shoah, it was very, very upsetting to read this book, of course, on many levels. But I wonder why the author did choose, whether it was because, in fact, she was trying to sort of write the wrongfully good reputation of the Dutch, and they're not like the Danish and the Swedish. They're not, and yet people think, oh yeah, the Dutch, they're great, and you know, there are lots of people. She could have said this, as we know, in any number of horrible Shoah-related countries, whether it be Austria. I don't have to listen, you know,
Or the United States.
Right. Right, but I'm talking about the Shoah specifically,
Yeah.
So why do you think she said? Any thoughts on that?
Any thoughts on why she said it there? Well, to the extent that you're right, that maybe she wants to set the record a little bit straighter than it's been. I mean, the Dutch had a significant fascist movement within the country. I think the initials are the NSB. There were lots of people who turned Jews in. There were lots of people who hid Jews, but there were lots of people who turned Jews in. And you're right, typically, I mean, we know the controversy, you know, about Poland, for example, and in the last few years on what you're permitted to say and not say about this issue of collaboration. So I don't have an answer of why, but I'm thankful that she did, because I think probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people will read this book. I don't know, but I think they will, and they'll get a more accurate picture that it's not, you know, it's not typically the way the history has been described up to this point. There is another book, I haven't read it. The author's last name is Rosner.
The Speed of Light
Is it The Speed of Light?
by Mrs. Rosner, or the cafe one?
No, not the, it's the same last name. It's not the cafe one. The Yellow Bird Sings is one novel this is a novelist. The Yellow Bird Sings, her new one that was just published, I think a few months ago, deals with hidden children. I haven't read it. I did listen to a Zoom interview with her last week or 2 weeks ago. Her technique is different. What she focuses on, I think she picks 3, 4, I believe, children, sort of case studies, fictional. And the 4th child, which is kind of interesting, is a Polish Catholic child who's kidnapped by the Nazis and taken back to Germany because he's seen as an Aryan Pole, and the Germans did that by the thousands. There are thousands of Polish children. So there is a hidden child history of Polish Catholics we should be aware of, and the other 3 are Jewish children. And this is the same person, maybe you remember, because we're in Rochester and we have the National Technical Institute for the Deaf here. This is the same person who wrote a long op-ed in the New York Times about 4 years ago. So she and her husband are hearing, and they gave birth, and she gave birth, I think, to twins, and the twins are deaf. And she wrote an op-ed piece about the importance, I'm getting to the point that it's related, about the importance of introducing her deaf children to the hearing world. That's the decision that she made with her husband as parents. Some of you know my wife Karen. She worked at NTID for 40 years. And this is a very controversial point in deaf culture. And she got hundreds, if not thousands, of letters saying, you're committing genocide against your children, you're cutting them off from their deaf culture, you know. And then she's reflecting, wait a second, my husband and I are the parents of these children, don't we have a voice? And, you know, it's an issue, I understand. So the point I'm making about it is people might say the same thing about Rosner writing a book about hidden children, or Elon writing a book about hidden children, that she doesn't have a person, like what's your connection? Okay, your connection is, you know, you're an Israeli or whatever, you know, you care about the subject, but it's not your experience. So I can't answer why she picked, I think she wanted, again, because this is the first novel of hers that I've read, so I don't know if any of you have read any other works by her. She seems, again, to Barbara's question, very interested in descriptive, you know, painting descriptive pictures of the place that she's writing about. That's important to her somehow. And she has the ability to do that. Maybe, you know, she could have, you know, one of the children in the Rosner book is from Krakow, beautiful city. You could do that with Krakow, okay? Some of you did. But, you know, I don't know, Polish countryside, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how much detail you could get. Even though Polish countryside is beautiful. But anyway, I don't know if that's a good answer, but...
It's just interesting that
Yeah.
the Dutch